ladies and gentlemen, and I can assure you this discussion is one of the highlights of our event here at the BMW Pavilion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a round of applause for Olga, KHAKOVA, and also the other panelists that's going to be introduced. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you, and I commend you all for sticking through this very important conversation. I know this is our last panel, and I can tell how important and still relevant the topic is because you're all here. So thank you for sticking with us. I'm very excited to say that we will kick off this timely conversation with some very special remarks from George Andreas Papandreou, who is the former Prime Minister of Greece. George, we're really excited to hear from you as a scene setter, as some special remarks. You know, you have such an extensive background, political background, and maybe you can give us some lessons learned of how we work through some challenging situations and transatlantic relations in the past. Maybe there's some exciting lessons learned for us. George, please, special remarks.
I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, fine. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, it is a very difficult situation, time of tension between Europe and the United States. When I was Prime Minister, actually, I was working quite close then with the President Obama, and he was helpful in the crisis and giving advice to Europe, which we didn't always follow, but I won't get into that those details. But I believe that we need, if we're looking at the situation today, we need to see Europe being autonomous in its energy supplies. And not simply diversifying to other outlets of energy from different parts of the world. We need to be less dependent, or I would say autonomous and independent in our energy. And that means also from the United States, but it also means from some of the countries that we maybe today are, not only Russia, but other countries that we have energy from. That means we need to move, and if we want to, at the same time, tackle climate change, it means we need to electrify Europe. Now, I know there is some pushback here in Germany, and or at least there has been I remember 10 years ago I was talking to somebody here, a German who was in aeronautics, and he was somewhat frustrated that the car industries were not moving so quickly in the electrifying of their cars and the production. That may change, but that's important. And I believe that also we have to really then see how we do create the type of energy which is climate friendly, therefore investing heavily in wind, solar, geothermal, researching in new areas of possible storage, whether it's hydrogen or new types of fuels, so we don't only depend on rare earth and imports from other countries or other areas of the world. And that, I think, is one of the major issues we have here in Europe. Also, local grids, smaller grids, and a transition, which may need to be a part of this, but a transition which does not lock us in again into the fossil fuels. A second point, from my experience, we have the Mediterranean, and we need to work also with North Africa, the MENA. This is an area where I remember when we found, and when I was Prime Minister, we found we had oil, petrol, we had gas, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt. I had an expert I talked to, Joe Stanislav, who has written a lot about this. He said, if the energy is within your country, it's an economic issue. Once you move outside the borders, it becomes a geopolitical issue. So one of the issues, I think, is I then decided to invite my counterpart, then Tayyip Erdogan, he was Prime Minister, not President, and we had an initiative in the Mediterranean. Now, the Mediterranean has a lot of conflicts. I believe, and this is what Europe should do, let us see this energy transition as not a crisis, but as an opportunity for peace, for building peace. So I think that's a second important point. A third point, maybe a little more controversial, China. I would say India too. Look at Africa. Why are we competing with China in Africa? And why don't we say, okay, you want to invest in Africa? We do too. We are worried about how you deal with the money. Well, we have some rules too. If we work together, we need to do this to build a greening economy in Africa for a number of reasons. First of all, for climate, but also because there's a huge population boom. And it will impact us. It already has, but it will impact us even more if they do not have growth. So we need to see how this energy transition is not only just, it's not only green, but it also does create new jobs, new opportunities for Europeans, but also for our region. I think I've passed my time. Oh, a little bit more, huh? I would say now with China, there is one more issue, which I want to get into a bit of geopolitics. I think we lost an opportunity when the Berlin Wall fell to build some basic rules of our engagement at the global level. We went from a bipolar to a unipolar world. America was the power. The United States, and I've told many of my friends in the United States this, I think made the mistake. Rather than creating a world where we all could live with our different systems, with our different politics, but in peace and in cooperation in some basic areas such as energy, such as climate change, we got into adventures such as Iraq war, Libya, Afghanistan, which we're paying for even today. Now, I think what we need to do, and Europe needs to play this role, because we are seeing from the United States today, this government is not interested in a rule-based world. It is might makes right. That is a world which will go to chaos and violence and conflict. Even if there are deals made, it will create a sense of whoever is stronger may be able to impose their will. Europe has to play the role, and in doing so, it has to talk to other powers. It has to bring the global south in, it has to talk to China, it has to talk to India, it has to bring them in. And hopefully at some point, the US will follow again. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to now introduce our star lineup panel. Lidia Pereira, who is a member of the European Parliament. Please join me on stage. Maxim Timchenko, who is the CEO of DTEC. Greg Jackson, the CEO of Octopus Energy, and Dan Poneman, who is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council and has many, many fantastic additional titles, but we will focus on that affiliation right now. Thank you all for joining us, and again, thank you to our audience. Look, you know, this BMW Foundation event on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, again, is a testament of how closely interlinked energy security is to hard security. And in so many ways, it's also a reminder that we can achieve so much more when we work on hard security, when we partner with our allies to defend our frontiers when it comes to hard security, but also when it comes to energy security and climate cooperation. Now, I want to start off this panel with taking just a really quick vote, raise of hands from the audience, just to get a feeling of where we are today with the people who are here. Despite the challenges in the transatlantic, or fractures, which is probably an understatement, in the transatlantic alliance, do we still believe, raise your hands if you do, that there are some opportunities, there's still some good things that we can do on climate and energy security issues in the next 4 years? Wow. I like this. I would say maybe 50%. Is that accurate? Okay, maybe 60%. 60. Looking good. All right. I will ask you this again in the end of the session. So, you know, be prepared. We're doing a little experiment. So, So look, let's just start off. If you can give me maybe a 1.5-minute answer each, just to kind of take the pulse of where we are. Lydia, we'll start with you. Are we as divided as it seems? Or should we dig a little deeper, and is there more context to the current situation? Or are things as tense as it feels whenever we check the news, whenever we check X, former Twitter?
Well, good afternoon, and first of all, let me thank you for the invitation to join the panel today. It's been a very interesting conference this last 48 hours, and in response to what you just asked me, I do believe that the past weeks have been very telling about the future, or about the short term at least. Perhaps what we are lacking at the moment is to understand what is the long-term strategy of the US in relation to the transatlantic relations. But the short term is a little bit more complicated. I was not very happy with what I heard from Vice President J.D. Vance yesterday. Not a word mentioned about Ukraine. This is not the main topic of our conversation. But at the same time, I'm realistic. I think we might be transitioning from a relation that has been based on cooperation or shared values to a relationship that will be much more transactional. So, and in this new framework, obviously there's a lot of opportunities, but I don't want to rush into, concluding that things will be turbulent all the times. There will have to be stability, because if there's no stability in Europe, if there's no stability in the world, that also means a bad business for the US. So in the interest of the US, it is good that there is stability in Europe. And for that, the transatlantic relationship, or this cooperation, will have to keep being strengthened.
Maxime?
Right, of course, I'm from Ukraine, and these 2 days was very important days for us in understanding what's going on around future of Ukraine. But I would say that it was wake-up calls or wake-up momentum. And not only about energy security of Europe, about defense of Europe, about future of Europe, but for Ukraine, it also wake up momentum for opportunities. And that's basically the message I brought here, saying that it's time coming not to see Ukraine as a war zone country. It's time to think how Ukraine can be converted from liability or burden for Europe to asset, how much we can add to energy security of European countries, and how much we can add to unity of European countries. I think that it was clear messages coming to all of us, Europeans, that it's time to think about our future, become independent, and I fully support all the messages from Prime Minister of Greece, that our future in our hands, and that's key message, and we're part of this future.
Thank you, Maxime. Greg?
First of all, I couldn't agree more with what you both said. So to build on those points, look, first of all, we don't know what the long term holds for our relationship with the US, indeed transatlantic relations generally.
Right.
I think we should hope for the best. And there are lots of people here who are looking for things to be optimistic about. But we also have to plan for the worst. I think what's come home to all of us is the extent to which, look, we think of climate as being a security issue, which is why there's climate components here. But energy is the short-term, medium-term, and long-term component of security. And powers that are energy-rich have weaponized their richness to exploit other nations and situations. Europe doesn't have to be an energy power. We have to be energy independent, so we can't be held hostage by energy powers. And I was talking to the CEO of Uniper. The planning horizon for Uniper, for Germany, when it became dependent on Russian gas, was that I think since almost through the Cold War, Russia honored its gas contracts. So the planning horizon was they will always honor the contracts. That planning assumption was wrong. And I think we need to make sure we don't make any wrong assumptions now. And we're already seeing the extent to which for example, Trump will weaponize trade with tariffs at the drop of a hat. So I think we need planning assumptions that are built around energy independence for Europe as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much, Greg. Dan, are things as bad as they seem? You had extensive experience working for two secretaries, Clinton and Kerry, and you were the U.S. rep. Is there some context to what's happening today?
There is a context, and I'm glad you mentioned that. I was actually present when they created the U.S. Energy Council. They raised it to ministerial level. I went with Secretary Clinton to Lisbon, Portugal in 2010. And then they upgraded that to a presidential level after the Ukraine invasion, right? The same issues that dominated then are still the same issues. It's still about, and it was then, about energy security. It was still about, as it was then, about the energy transition. It was still about cooperation in places we could in terms of innovation, renewables, etc. So I think sometimes in the fetid atmosphere that we get in, we sometimes lose sight of those long-term interests. And I think those things persist. And the thing that has changed, and the energy dialogue change, was exactly February 24th, 2022. That changed the whole dialogue, and they were still the same elements, but the dominant theme became the imperative to wean off of Russian imports of natural gas. And thank goodness the shale gas revolution enabled that. So since 2021, the U.S. has been the biggest supplier of LNG, enabling 50 million BCM to come into Europe to solve that problem. So we have to continue in that. And the oil dependence has diminished. The gas dependence has diminished. We have to keep working on the nuclear piece, where there's still a lot of dependence on Russian enriched uranium. So I think we have to focus on those things and remember that underlying whatever is happening at the government levels, these transactional elements are very important to actually providing the variety that Winston Churchill said back in 1913 is the only source of energy security.
Thank you, Dan. Maxime, I know you're tight on time, and you unfortunately have to leave us at 6 p.m., so we'll go to you for the follow-up question. I really loved what you mentioned on, treating Ukraine as a partner, not a charity case, really looking at the opportunities, and there's so much. DTEC's story is very much a Ukraine story of resilience, overcoming challenges in spite of this war, and deploying new projects against the backdrop of this horrific invasion. 3 years in, what are some of the key opportunities and some maybe tangible projects or technologies where U.S. and European partners can partner with DTEC on?
Quite often I'm saying that probably DTEC is the company where all possible corporate risks realized. So for 20 years, we experienced everything: war, economic turbulence, destruction. In July 2024, 90% of our production facilities, generation facilities, were damaged or destroyed. But in 2024, we started the largest wind farm, construction, the largest wind farm in Ukraine. We brought the first US LNG cargo to Greece. And great appreciation to Greece. We use your terminal. It was first Ukrainian company brought US LNG, and using this so-called vertical corridor to use Ukrainian gas storage facilities. So we started project 200 megawatt battery storage in Ukraine, investing 140 million euro. So we live, like, in my mind, parallel world. Yesterday, drones destroyed another transformer to our solar farm, and we lost half of capacity. And today we started the first construction foundation for the wind turbines. And it's all about resilience, and it's all about cooperation. If you don't have US partners agreed on terms to supply LNG, then we would never have this first pilot deal. If you don't have Vestas agreed to help us build wind farms remotely, and educated our employees because they still cannot send their people to Ukraine, then we would never do that. So today our message is that with all our experience in Ukraine, we want to be a gate opener for companies to come to Ukraine, to get this first move advantage. If we afforded to build such a projects and invested more than 1.2 billion euro during the last 2.5 years, why not foreign companies can at least start developing their projects in Ukraine, start understanding what is happening in Ukraine. And as I said, go piece by piece. Don't look at the map and think that Ukraine out of our corporate map. Start doing these things and then it will repay. So we're ready to cooperate. I think partnership is the key word for companies in Ukraine. We're on the ground. We know how things can be done. And I think it's time not only for investments, but for contribution into energy security of Europe. It's much easier to build wind and solar farms in Ukraine, to go through all bureaucracy. So because we have experience building in European countries, and I can, from my own experience, can say that it will save from 12 to 18 months to develop the same project in Ukraine. So we know how to do it by Ukrainian hands, and basically we realizing projects in Romania and Poland, and 80% of this project done by Ukrainian engineering, Ukrainian project managers, and EPC contractors. So I think it's time to move a bit from emergency support of Ukraine to commercial projects in Ukraine, to be creative in building access to capital. This is what we need now in Ukraine, because we cannot get commercial funding. We need support of governments and financial institutions and ECAs. And that's basically what we talk about in Germany. And try to do something with the tech.
How was this message received in Munich in your meetings? How was this approach? Were there ideas or tangible things that came out? How did the partners respond?
To be honest, I start feeling that the spirit and attitude to Ukraine started changing in Davos last month. We had more business meetings. I see clear interest of investors and funds, at least asking questions. Because 1, 2, 3 years ago, it was, guys, we all respect you, ready to support you, we're ready to send you equipment, but let's put apart discussion about projects and building something new. Now it's changing. It's not changing at the speed which we want to have, but my hope that in 1-2 months' time we will announce our first partnership with Greek company in Ukraine. I hope with French company in Ukraine, and my wish that German company will appear as our partners for new projects in Ukraine. It started moving. That's what I can see from the ground, from Ukraine.
Yeah, some positive news during a really challenging time. Thank you, Maxime. Lydia, can we go back to you on kind of the role of European government, parliament, but also working with the Commission, new leadership in US and in Europe. How are things changing in terms of your approach to figuring out how to work with the United States, but also maybe taking a look at how Europe can strengthen its own energy security in order to be a stronger player in this game?
I'm glad that you asked such question, because I wanted to comment very briefly on the words of former Prime Minister Papandreou. He referred a lot to climate change, and I have been at the last COP29 the head of delegation on behalf of the European Parliament to Baku COP29, and it was very interesting to see how a vast majority of countries in the world, they look at Europe as a reference because they are being severely affected by climate change. But when we look at the internal situation in Europe, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about decarbonization, when we talk about curbing the energy costs, and on top of that, then we are addressing climate change. So this is something that has to be in our minds, because we don't have the same energetic resources as in the US has. So the only competitive advantage we have today is the development of clean technologies that will enable us to become fully independent from third countries on our energy supplies. Now, we don't do this overnight. This has been something that has been planned, but we have now to move very concretely. And I'm not saying this in a dogmatic way. I'm not saying that Europe will shift into 100% renewable energy supply. Perhaps it will not be possible. But if we manage our mix better, diversify, and at the same time that we remain independent, then we can address all the other elements. But first, and this is the priority, we've been hearing a lot about Mario Draghi report. today he published another article, a very interesting article in Financial Times. But we need to move into action. And the 5 past years in the European Parliament were very much shaped by an ideological view that did not match the need of today, which is competitiveness. And I'm not saying these questioning our need to lead on climate change. I'm a strong advocate of that, because we show the way, we show it is possible, but we cannot undermine our businesses because of this priority in the world. So how do we do this? We have to do this alone. We cannot do it, right? And so the US being on board would be extremely important. At COP29, I observed the absence of the US of the negotiations, but I saw other countries jumping in and saying, look guys, we want to cooperate on that. Guess who was that? China, right? So that's why it says a lot on how we're going to do this from now on. It is crucial that we become energy independent. It is crucial that Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union. It is crucial that Europe is in the negotiation table for a long and just peace in Ukraine. But we cannot neglect the geopolitical side of this conversation here. And that's why, and I will conclude with this, that is why it's so critical that we really make progress on our investments on the clean tech side, because otherwise we will be looking in 10 years from now with some regret. We could have done that. So it is really critical that all the 27 member states are on board with this. And I was a little bit, not surprised, because it's often the position, but not very convinced with the remarks made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs earlier today from France, saying, well, we have to engage in bilateral agreements. No, dear Minister, we need collectively Europe to speak at one voice on this important matter, because we saw that the agreements of the past between France, Spain and Portugal were not the wisest. We need an energy union, and this has to be the message. And we need leadership on this, not just one person pushing for defending their own interests in Europe. We need desperately an energy union.
I definitely, yes. I want to come back to that cohesion within EU later. But let me go to Greg next. Octopus Energy has grown exponentially since 2016 through COVID, through Brexit, through energy crisis, multiple wars, all of this unpredictable environments and different types of challenges. Does this era now, that seems extremely challenging again in different ways, does it also bring some exciting opportunities for a company?
Thank you for a great leading question. Look, first of all, I've got to say our challenges have been nothing compared to Max's. And I think to try and synthesize the story from here, but briefly answer your question first. Look, as a young entrepreneur, I always wondered, how did companies make it through the Great Depression? Right? How did companies make it through wars? Yeah. And then I realized at some point, we were living through these times. And you look, Walt Disney was founded 11 months before the Great Depression, right? Hewlett-Packard, the same. And so I think as businesses, there's absolutely opportunity in crisis. And so we're hearing Max now converting the ultimate crisis into actually a series of incredibly compelling opportunities about working with Ukraine. But just to illustrate the degree to which I mean that, last year, the Ukraine, I think you built 200 times more onshore wind turbines than England and Wales put together, right? And now, England and Wales are both pretty windy countries. We are completely failing to recognize the opportunity and the scale of both the challenge and the need for national security, climate threat, and low-cost energy. And to build on your point on China, I recently visited Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, and I flew from there to New York. It was like going back in time, right? Up to 30% of the vehicles on the roads in those cities were now electric. All of the two-wheeled vehicles that used to create the smog and pollution, nearly all the buses, all of the taxis, vans, even a lot of the cars. And I landed in New York, where you had huge Chevy Suburbans, idling in terrible traffic, and the buses were disgusting. And I say this because I think we have to paint an optimistic picture of what will come as we move from the crisis to the world we want to build. And with great respect, I mean, you know, America's led the way on some of this stuff. Californian air pollution legislation set the standards for companies around the world. But I think we're now seeing that the Chinese investment in clean energy technology, which was a very deliberate strategic move in the early 2000s, has enabled them to open a gap that is getting increasingly hard to close. The reality is that Europe can't make batteries as good as China, even using their equipment, because we just don't have the skills and the expertise. If we're not careful, the same will end up applying to our automobile industries. And the answer to this is not to build bigger walls and barriers to protect incumbents and prevent change. It's to find ways to use this to spur change. And the reality is that across most of Europe now, we can create a renewable system that is cheaper than the LNG we're importing from the rest of the world. We may need some LNG for a while to balance our system in countries where it's not always windy or sunny. But as we start to build out this system, we can literally be reducing energy costs. And I think the real opportunity, when we think about how does Europe do this, is to say no longer will we subsidize dirty incumbents, and instead, we will allow change to occur. And we have to do that for our own energy security. By the way, we can still work brilliantly with some of the great leaders in the US, and I hope we remain long-term friends. But actually, we have the opportunity to be the future of cleaner, cheaper energy and cleaner air, better cities, a better environment. And I think that we can create a positive picture for our citizens. But we do need to do that, because so far we're risking this backlash. The way we went around this for the first half of the energy transition was we turned up and we built wind farms where people didn't want them. We then put an extra line on their bills to charge them extra. So let's make the next half of the energy transition the one that is beneficial to our citizens, and we need to do that now. And one thing we do in the UK, we're in trial programs. We give people cheap electricity when it's windy if they live near a wind turbine. We expect them to use more energy when it's windy, and they do. What we didn't expect was 40,000 communities have asked for wind turbines, right? So my challenge back to our great political leaders is work with us to sell the vision with short-term benefits right now that people see from this transition, and a long-term picture that is not one about the sacrifices we have to make, but the benefits we're going to reap.
Thank you. No, that's an extremely compelling vision, which I think we're all very hungry for today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. Thank you, Greg. Dan, you mentioned something on the nuclear supply chains, that the work is not done to diversify away from Russia in Europe. In other ways, nuclear is also one of those constant topics, areas where we have seen bipartisan cooperation, bipartisan support, especially on the US side. Tell us what that looks like, what that progress could look like, even in the next couple of years. What are some things that we should focus on?
Facts are stubborn things. And if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 1.5 degree report, or if you read the Fatih Birol studies of IEA, you don't come within a country mile of net zero without tripling nuclear. That's why COP28 and COP29, between the two of them, you have over 30 governments having pledged to that. In the United States, and you may have noticed we've had some political conversations in our country. You had a Nuclear Fuel Security Act passed 96-3. You had an Advance Act passed with nuclear regulatory reform 88-2. Perhaps if you said the sun rises in the east, you could not get that kind of a vote. Now we have to move to deployment. We know how to do this, but because of the bad politics, frankly, that have surrounded things for reasons well known here, Chernobyl, Fukushima, we got off track. We're now in the process of getting back on track. We're now building again. You have very strong consensus in much, if not to say most of Europe, that this is necessary. So now we have to accelerate that deployment, because if you're looking for, as Bill Gates said, the only clean energy source that's been proved to work day and night, you know, windy or still, winter, summer, spring, and fall, anywhere, it's nuclear. So we have to get there. Now, the thing about energy security that's not often realized is when we weren't paying attention, we allowed the world to become overly dependent on Russian imports of enriched uranium. United States, 20%, 20% in Europe. And if you do simple arithmetic, the amount of enriched uranium required by each of Europe and the United States cannot be replaced by existing available resources elsewhere. So we've got to be investing more in that. But I want to say one other thing, sort of keying off my colleagues' comments. I think we have to remember the energy security piece is still very important. And I think having learned what is uncomfortable about depending on foreign supplies of oil, gas, and enriched uranium, let's not make the same mistake for the critical minerals that we now depend on. China controls 75% of the supply chain. We do not want to jump out of the frying pan into the fire, nor do we wish to import their pollution if they are able to get these very cheap prices by emitting a lot of carbon in the production of these things. So it's, I think, a fact that the solar panel industries in Europe and the United States were basically clobbered by the overproduction in China. It's now happening with batteries. So I think we have to be mindful if we are worried about things I heard about from my German colleagues about deindustrialization of Europe, that we don't inadvertently subsidize the destruction of our own industries by going very easily to an overdependence on now China, which not only has 75% of the control of the processing, but by buying up assets in other parts of the world, cobalt, copper, etc., we are at risk of falling right back into the same trap that we just are trying to get out of with Russia.
Thank you so much, Dan. Lydia, let's go back to your previous comments on the importance of internal cohesion across the member states and kind of having a strategy that's aligned, even when dealing with the United States and other partners and adversaries out there. But there are gaps. I think that over the last couple of days, even within this pavilion, we heard multiple examples of internal disjointments in, even regulations within the member states, how they're implemented. And that becomes a barrier for companies that are looking to invest and scale up and don't want to look through 27 different manuals for how to do good work and how to grow. How is that going? I know with the omnibus coming up and with the competitiveness compass, some of that is being recognized and dealt with, but what are you hoping to achieve this year?
Yeah, well, it is. We've been talking a lot about in the past days about tariffs, and actually the title of Draghi's article today in Financial Times is that Europe managed to create internal tariffs with the examples that you just mentioned. When we talk about directives that are transposed into national law and we create an additional burden, that is obviously a problem. And that's something that we have to correct as of now. I hope the Omnibus really sets the scene for the other laws, directives, regulations that need to be reviewed, because, we are... being a parliamentarian in the European Parliament, we often hear the criticism. Oh, you guys in the European Parliament, you're always creating legislation which makes our lives miserable and so on. But we are never very, diligent in looking at our national realities and understanding, yeah, well, but, our national parliaments usually tend to make the scene much worse than what is set in the European law. So this is something, obviously, that has to be taken care of with a different eye, or with a different, with more leadership, also from the national governments and from their respective national parliaments, because otherwise we will not fix it. So this is I think critical, and I do believe that we have all the conditions. I mean, there's a momentum now. So if we miss the momentum, then we are a bit doomed, I think. But the leadership of the President of the European Commission, I think, has been very clear on that. And so all the commissioners are sensitive to the fact that we really have to change things, not forgetting the role of the national parliaments in this.
Thank you so much. I'm actually being told that we have less time than on this clock. So final questions for both of you. Greg, in terms of you've provided such a positive, exciting vision in terms of the opportunities that are still there. But what is on your wish list in terms of what would make your life easier?
Yeah, so I think we need to understand that when we change the sources and uses of electricity, we fundamentally change our system. That means our markets and infrastructure need to change. And that's not happening fast enough. So very quickly, conscious time, a couple of examples. It's not always windy and it's not always sunny. But if all the cars in the UK were electric, their combined battery capacity would be, as you do the maths, 2,500 gigawatt hours. No one knows what that means, but the UK is a 50 gigawatt system, i.e. we've got enough electricity just sitting in those cars to power an entire country for 2 days. And by the way, there's always going to be some sources of energy, but that's the backup you get literally for free when you move to a clean system. And so I think what we need to be doing is saying, look, we need to be looking now at a total system view and building the markets to enable this. And that's why we talk about energy flexibility. If the UK, I use the UK just because I know the numbers better, but it applies everywhere. If the UK had a flexible energy system with locational pricing, we could reduce our new grid build by 30%. That would save around 50 billion euros. We could reduce our total energy cost, electricity cost, by 50 billion euros over the next 10 to 15 years. And we could attract data centers. Scotland would go from the most expensive electricity in Europe to the cheapest because of the wind. And so I think these problems with intermittency are entirely real. But the opportunities of abundance are completely forgotten. And the last bit I'd add to this is, of course, I do worry about the critical minerals, for example. But there is a difference. If we're dependent on foreign gas, then we need it every day. If we're dependent on critical minerals for things like batteries and cars, at least if it ever gets cut off, all the batteries and cars we've got, we get to keep. And so we need to keep building as quickly as we can this new system while we can.
Thank you so much. Dan, just a couple of minutes, final question. Flying back to Washington, D.C., what kind of messages are you taking back from Munich, from this conversation?
I think there's still a willingness to cooperate. I think the most important thing I've picked up here, and I'm going to use it for my last point, is the one thing we haven't discussed, probably the first session in the 2 days, that hasn't talked about AI. Yeah. AI is driving a vertiginous increase in power demand. And we're going to need prodigious amounts of energy to satisfy that demand. We're talking about in the United States alone going from like 2% to 10% of electricity just to power data centers. That's like as much electricity as is consumed by France, okay? So, and I take my colleague's points very well. If we're powering electric vehicles in the United States by coal and gas, you're still not solving the problem. So we're going to need all of the above, just as we've needed it for many years, and we're going to have a lot more of it. So you're going to have the investments, and you're going to have to do one other thing, which I know is not politically popular anywhere. We're going to have to start to figure out how to internalize all of the impositions on society that dirty energy imposes, a social cost of carbon, call it what you will, and we have to find a way to mobilize those large amounts of capital that will allow us to diversify, that will allow us to cooperate on a level playing field if we need to with carbon adjustment mechanisms or whatever it can be. I believe my final message is when we work together, there's like nothing we cannot do, and I don't leave any less hopeful about that today than when I arrived here 2 days ago.
That's an incredible message.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are out of time, but as I promised, I will ask you the same question I asked at the very top. Do we still think there are opportunities for climate and energy security cooperation despite of all the differences? Raise your hands if you agree. I think we picked up some, I see some hands that weren't raised before. All right, give it up for this fantastic panel. Greg, Lydia, Maxime, who is gone, and Dan. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.